evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Discover Cal lecture series. Tonight's event represents UC Berkeley's commitment to bring our campus to our many alumni, parents, and friends throughout the Bay Area. My name is Courtney Mufich. I'm a senior in the College of Letters and Sciences majoring in English.
My name is Sean Chappell. I'm also a senior in the College of Letters and Science. I'm double majoring in integrative biology and French. Why? Next lecture. Courtney and I are both student ambassadors for the campus, and a large part of our job includes giving campus tours. To be a student ambassador, one must learn all of what makes UC Berkeley a premier public university, from the College of Natural Resources at the west end of campus, all the way up to the Lawrence Berkeley Lab on the top of our rugged eastern foothills. The opportunity to showcase the history, faculty, achievements, and culture of the campus to the thousands of prospective students who visit campus each week have led Courtney and I to believe that it is really us who have the best jobs on campus.
Tonight, we're honored to showcase a part of our campus with you as part of the Discover Cal lecture series. To help us, we've brought along a few friends who represent the caliber of teaching and intellectual vigor to which we students are exposed to on a daily basis. Before we begin tonight, we'd like to recognize a few of those special guests in the audience. First, we have our Chancellor and Mrs. Birgeneau. We also joining us tonight is Vice Chancellor Scott Biddy. As well as David Akhov, the Consul General of Israel for the Pacific Northwest. The Chair of the Political Science Department, Paul Pearson. And our two guest speakers for tonight, Professor Bruce Cain and Mr. Dan Schnur.
Our first speaker joined the UC Berkeley family in the fall of 2004 as the 9th Chancellor of the university. He's a world-renowned physicist and leading voice for affordable education for all. He is also not too bad of a mic man at Cal football games. We students love seeing him grab the mic, jump up in front of the students, and lead our section in a round of deafening Go Bears. Please welcome Chancellor Birgeneau.
Actually, a little bit arrogantly, I don't do a bad job as mic man, but my wife is the best. So greetings and welcome to Discover Cal, which is Berkeley's traveling lecture series. And Discover Cal gives us a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with our alumni, parents and friends, and demonstrate the many ways that Berkeley helps to address the challenges that we're facing today. There we go, good. So I'm, as you just heard, Chancellor Robert Birgeneau, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program on the 2008 elections, featuring two of our leading faculty on this issue, Bruce Cain and Dan Schnur. Bruce and Dan. I'm very excited about this myself. I must say, Mary Kath and I were in India on a sort of ambassadorial mission for Berkeley just a month ago, and everyone wanted to talk about the elections. I don't think any election in modern history has attracted more attention than this one has, and more admiration, not just attention, but admiration, both for liberals and for conservatives of what's happened in the Republican Party and what's happening in the Democratic Party. And so I think, this is just extraordinary what's been going on. Before we launch on that, I'm going to give you a little preview of things going on in the campus. I think all of you know that Berkeley is, I don't have to tell you, you're all part of the family, that Berkeley is a very special place that teaches students to think critically, sometimes too critically. If you were at the student event I was at last night with the activist students, and motivates them to achieve. It was perfect because these students told me I was being disrespectful, and I said, what does that mean? And it meant I didn't agree with every single thing they said. The diversity of ideas, experiences, and cultures at Berkeley gives our students a remarkable global outlook and a strong sense of public service. Interestingly, historically, UC Berkeley has produced more Peace Corps volunteers than any other university in the United States. In addition, more Berkeley undergraduates have gone on to get PhDs, whether it's at Berkeley or Stanford or Harvard, than any other university in the United States. And it's no wonder that our university inspires so many people to become leaders in society. This includes creators like Doug Engelbart, who discovered the mouse. May not have thought that had to be discovered, but it did. And innovators like Steve Wozniak, who's the co-founder, of course, of Apple Computer. Movement leaders like acclaimed chef Alice Waters, one of the great pleasures of living in Berkeley. And story weavers like author Joan Didion. Activists like the great athlete Kevin Johnson, NBA All-Star, and founder of St. Hope, which revitalizes inner cities, and as you may have heard, is now running for mayor of Sacramento. And satirists like Scott Adams, creator of Dilbert. Educators like Ida Jackson, the first African American to receive a California teaching certificate. And crusaders like Nobel laureate Stephen Chu, a champion for clean energy. Trendsetters like Jan Wenner, co-founder of Rolling Stone magazine, and friend seekers like Tom Anderson, who has over 200 million friends as the co-founder of MySpace.com. As all of you know, we have extraordinarily talented students. In this fall's entering class, 98% of our class were in the top 10% of their high school, and extraordinarily high grade point averages. Berkeley's, of course, an internationally renowned university, but at its core, we're a state public teaching and research university with 90% of our undergraduate students, by agreement with the state, coming from California. Notably, 36% of our students come from families with incomes under $45,000 a year. Such students receive federal Pell Grants, and you may have noted there's been a lot of publicity in the media lately. I've actually been often quoted as the public university spokesperson by the private universities. Columbia just announced today, MIT announced on Friday, Harvard before them, Yale before them, Stanford before them, about their incredible financial aid packages. It's nevertheless relevant to point out that at Berkeley, we have more students on Pell Grants, that is, coming from families whose family income is under about $40,000 a year, than all of the Ivy League universities put together. Currently at Cal, our student academic fees are about $7,200 a year, but because of the very high cost of living in the Bay Area, the total student budget is about $25,000. And if your family income is $200,000 a year, $25,000 is fine. If your family income, like 4,000 of our students, is $20,000 a year, then $25,000 can look insurmountable. So one of our biggest challenges is to provide enough financial aid that any student in California who's qualified to attend Berkeley will in fact actually be able to, and that's our deepest commitment. This is obviously the fact that we have 7,500 such students at Berkeley right now means that currently our financial aid system works relatively well. However, when we project 10 years forward, we predict that the average student from a family whose family income is $20,000 a year will have to provide $16,000 on their own. each year for 4 years. And this obviously is absolutely not acceptable. So we need a breakthrough on financial aid. Now, it might initially seem like an impossible task to you, but I had an op-ed on this subject in USA Today. So every single person in America who stayed in a Marriott got to read my article. and in the op-ed, I pointed out, I was going to say this is not a pitch, but actually it is, that if every one of our graduates wrote out a single check of $1,000, just once, $1,000, and the state matched it, we could guarantee accessibility at Cal for the rest of eternity. So this is not an insurmountable problem if our alumni and the state step up. I think as all of you know, besides this extraordinary student body, we also have an extraordinary faculty. You're about to get exposed to them, or reminded of them. And as you know, in virtually any ranking, Berkeley is always listed among the world's great universities. My favorite quote comes from the Washington Monthly, which I have to say did have a peculiar ranking system, because in their ranking system, Harvard came 43rd. It's true. I don't know how they came that high, actually. Because the ranking was based on social relevance. And so the Washington Monthly, which ranked universities based on social relevance, said, and this is an exact quote, "By our yardstick, the University of California, Berkeley is about the best thing for America we can find." And of course, we have an extraordinary faculty, and these are the sort of, if you're an ambitious academic in all fields, you hope to get elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy. If you're just a little bit lucky, you may win a Nobel Prize. If you fail at that, you become a chancellor. National Academy of Engineering, National Medal of Science. I guess the most selective of the scholarly societies is the American Philosophical Society that was established by Benjamin Franklin. And here we list the lead universities in all of these, and it's a common theme, which is that there's Harvard, Stanford, MIT, and Berkeley. And so there is Berkeley always, that's our faculty. Our faculty are in the mix always, and often in the lead, like in the National Academy of Engineering. You might not have thought that in fact Berkeley has, I mean, we know it, but not all the rest of the world, when they think of engineering, they may not necessarily first think of Berkeley, but we have the most distinguished engineering faculty in the entire world, and then broadly in all the other fields. This fall, we dedicated 2 wonderful new buildings, the C.B. Starr East Asian Library / Changlin Tien Center for East Asian Studies, wonderful new building on Memorial Glade. And then just up the street from it, we also opened the new Stanley Hall, which is a magnificent center for bioscience research in health, energy, and the environment. We're also working to revitalize the southeast quadrant of the campus with, as you know, a by now long delayed construction of a new student athletic high performance center and seismic retrofitting of Memorial Stadium. And I'm not going to talk about the trees. Many of you will also have heard in an international competition, in fact, the finalists in the competition were ourselves, UC San Diego, MIT, Cambridge University in England, and Imperial College in London, that in this competition, Berkeley won. And I have to say, as the former Dean of Science of MIT, I took extraordinary pleasure in that. And this is truly unprecedented that we were awarded a $500 million research grant from the Global Energy Corporation, BP, to create the Energy Biosciences Institute, which is a partnership with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the Lawrence Berkeley Lab and the Global Energy Corporation, BP. This is in some ways I think absolutely representative of the very best of Berkeley. First of all, it calls on our best minds to address what many would argue is the most important problem that society faces, which is that of global warming. Secondly, if you ask who's most threatened by global warming, having just returned from India, we were reminded that on this planet there are 1 billion people who live on 50 cents a day or less, do not have access to electricity, and if global warming proceeds at its current pace, those 1 billion lives will be threatened. And so, in my view, there's no more noble scientific and technology goal than solving the problem of global warming, which will have huge impact, not just on the United States, but on the least advantaged people on our planet. And with the establishment of the Energy Bioscience Institute, which has been formally started and is going, and I do have to admit with some embarrassment, we brought in to lead it a brilliant professor from Stanford, Chris Somerville, who's moved to the Berkeley faculty. My embarrassment is, however, moderated by the fact that he's a fellow Canadian. Of course, there are always exciting things going on. Our development efforts have been going well. This past year, 58,000 donors gave to Cal and gave a total of $268 million. And we're almost at that mark this year. And that's because of an extraordinary grant from the Hewlett Foundation based in Palo Alto, in which the Hewlett Foundation gave us a matching grant of $113 million to establish 100 new chairs, which will be broadly distributed across the university. We laid out a plan for raising these chairs in concert with the Hewlett Foundation on the assumption it would take us 7 years to raise the matching money. So this requires raising $110 million of matching money. And I'm pleased to say after 6 months out of the 7 years, we've raised 50 out of the 100 chairs. And so it's been extraordinary in the way people have stepped up. And I have to say my favorite of those chairs, and you'll understand why, is one that's just established in honor of Bob Haas of the Levi Strauss family, one of our most distinguished graduates and of the Haas Business School graduate. And when he stepped down as president of Levi Strauss, the foundation called me up and said they wanted to honor him, and how about one of these Hewlett chairs? So I thought I'd be brave, and I suggested one of the $3 million chairs in the area of equity and inclusion, because Bob's had a history of public service and of commitment to inclusion in society. So we made an official proposal, and they called back and they said so it was $1.5 million from Hewlett, $1.5 million nominally from Levi Strauss to honor Bob Haas. They called back and said, this really isn't quite distinguished enough, and we'd like to give you $3.5 million to match the $1.5 million. And I debated for a long time. So we now have created a new, this is literally true, the first of a new kind of chair, which is a $5 million honorific chair, and Bob, in the name of Bob Haas, which we're obviously delighted about. So, very exciting time at Cal, unbelievable challenges, especially in the world that we find ourselves in. I'll give you one, I don't want to finish with a depressing note, but just for people to understand the competitive landscape. With Stanford's rise in their endowment, that being our principal competitor, with a 5% payout, the income from Stanford's endowment, this is not counting fees, not counting anything else, just the income from their endowment is $300 million a year more than the state gives us to run Berkeley. Just think about that. And we're winning the race. But we cannot win the race indefinitely and maintain the public character of Berkeley with this extraordinary student body without your continued support. And I want to thank you for all the support you've given us so far, and I'm going to thank you now in advance for the support I'm sure you'll give us in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor. Our next speaker tonight is a graduate of Bowdoin College. What? Oh, sorry. He went on to become a Rhodes Scholar at Trinity College of Oxford, and then obtained a PhD from Harvard University. After joining the Cal faculty in 1989, in 2000 he received the Zale Award for Outstanding Achievement in Policy, Research, and Public Service. He also was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Bruce Cain.
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't mention that the Zale Award was given to me by Stanford University. Would have ruined the proceedings. I'm very pleased to be back in San Francisco and to be speaking to this group, which includes not only friends and prior acquaintances, but also a number of former students who always come up to me and say, "Do you remember me?" after they've changed their hair color, lost weight, and aged. And of course, they never neglect to tell me that I have more gray hair. But it's fun to see them. Now, people say, "Well, Bruce, what are you doing in Washington, D.C.?" And answer number one is, I'm having a lot of fun. If you're a student of politics, there isn't a better place to be. Now, that wasn't initially true a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when I arrived, because really people from California were persona non grata in Washington a couple years ago. And there's been a sea change in their openness to people from California and to ideas from California just in the short time that I've been there, and that's been fascinating. But the other reason that I'm there is that I'm passionate about producing more students that could go into public service. And I worry a lot about the contemporary environment where kids have to take more loans, an issue I know our chancellor is concerned about. And then when they have to consider going into public service, which often, at least at the entry level, doesn't pay very well, and they have to consider private sector jobs, it may, on the balance, be taking some of our best and brightest minds and keeping them out of public service. So I've become somewhat passionate on this issue. And there are some co-conspirators who have done a lot to help Berkeley produce more distinguished public service. And I want to acknowledge them before I tell you what I think about the election. First, I want to start with the chancellor, who, without any publicity, has subsidized students coming to UC Washington Center to do internships. It costs about $3,000 more a semester to come there, and he has been extremely generous in assisting these students so that they can come and do their internships and become possible public servants. And I'm very appreciative for the chancellor's support. Secondly, the Travers family. We're missing Chuck and Nancy, but we've got Beth, Todd, and Gail. And the Travers family has supported the political science department, but a part of that has been to support Travers Fellows, some of whom have gone on to very distinguished positions of government, including in the Schwarzenegger administration. And their support came at a very critical time, so we're very appreciative of that and the loyalty that they've shown to Cal. And then there's the class of '68. The mere phrase, class of '68, still strikes fear in the heart of some Berkeley administrators, not the chancellor. But some Berkeley administrators, I know this from my dealings with them over the last 6 months, the mere term class of '68 makes them tremble, and rightly so, and the class of '68 is proud of that. They were challenging the status quo back in 1968, and they continue to challenge the status quo, to say, why not? Why can't we do it this way? Yes, we can, all right? That there's a way to fundraise that keeps us involved, that it becomes a class project like you've never seen before. And it gave the development people a heart attack initially, but I give the development people all the credit in the world. They've calmed down. I'm not sure what they're on, but whatever it is, it's working. So continue to take those drugs. And then lastly, Dan Schnur. Dan and I had a conversation a little bit over a decade ago when he was transitioning off of Governor Wilson's staff, and he said, well, is there any chance that I could be involved in the program at the IGS? And I said, I got the deal for you. Why don't you teach a course with me? And so I can't remember how many years ago, 12 or 13 years ago, we did a course on elections by a political scientist and a campaign consultant. And we combined the very practical pragmatic perspective of how you actually get things done, which isn't taught, as many people point out, in political science journals, with whatever political science wisdom there is out there. And it was a successful course, and Dan has taken that course and developed it. And I was just asking him, as an example, 11 at the peak, he claims 11 members of the Schwarzenegger administration were graduates of the classes that he taught. Now, I can tell you in Washington there are many numbers of students that are on the Democratic side too. So it's not that we're just turning out from one party or another. But I do point the Republican out because when Dan first started, Republicans really were orphans in the UC Berkeley, and for them to have a father was a big deal. Oh, I'm not implying anything about their, well, anyway. Okay, so what are my 3 points? Let me talk about the election. First, the Democratic race is, I'm going to exaggerate a bit, is all about demographics, and the Republican race was all about ideology. Well, not quite, but pretty damn close. Because one of the things that I do after every election is I go to the CNN website and I go through the exit poll. And I look at the numbers in the exit poll. And I'm used to seeing demographic differences in general elections. We've had a gender gap, women voting for the Democratic Party more than the Republican Party since about 1976. So during the Reagan years, the gender gap developed, and in some years it's more than others. But what you're not used to seeing are gender gaps in Democratic primaries. They don't always appear. And certainly nothing as dramatic as what you see this time around. Now on the Republican side, you can see ideological differences. You can see them in the exit polls when they say what percentage of conservatives supported Mitt Romney, what percentage of conservatives supported John McCain. You could also see it in the pattern of returns. I went through and looked at all the congressional returns, and you could see that John McCain did better in the Democratic districts than in the Republican districts. Why? Because there's a contextual effect. The Democrats, if the Democrats are in the majority, Republicans tend to take on the texture and the attitudes of the Democrats in that district, so they tend to be more moderate. And vice versa, when Democrats are in Republican areas, they tend to be more conservative. And so you can see those differences in the polls. But in some sense, it masks what's really the nuanced split in the Conservative Party, which never really allowed the conservatives to consolidate against John McCain. And that is, there's really a three-way split in the Republican Party that's developed over the last 5 or 6 years, probably longer than that, but it's become more noticeable in the last 5 or 6 years, and that's between what I like to call the eco-cons, the theo-cons, and the neo-cons. That is, the economic conservatives, the fiscal conservatives who want to cut taxes and keep government as lean as possible. The neocons who are for a muscular foreign policy unilateralism, right? And the theocons who are the social conservatives that ironically want the state to be more intrusive rather than less intrusive, but on behalf of family values. And that coalition was held together by a very unique individual, George Bush, who managed to combine those attributes. But after 8 years and some disappointments, that coalition has fallen apart. And John McCain benefited from the fact that essentially he has 2 out of the 3. 2 out of the 3 ain't bad. He's an economic conservative, and he's definitely a neocon in the sense that he is for a muscular foreign policy. But he's not a social conservative, or at least not to the degree that the evangelicals want. And so you look and you see in many of the congressional districts in California, but across the country, that had the conservatives gotten together, if Huckabee and Romney's numbers had combined, that it would have been a much tougher race for John McCain. So that was all about ideology, but the Democratic race is about demographics. And in particular, there are 4 that jump out of the data time and time again, and they have not changed, and that's really important because with the exception of Wisconsin and a few places, the 2 candidates are very much rutted in grooves. So much so that you can almost anticipate the outcome of a Democratic primary before it happens based on the composition of the particular electorate of the state. It's not quite that deterministic, but it's awfully close. And what are the 4? Well, first of all, gender. And as I said, we're used to seeing gender across party lines. We're not quite as used to seeing it within party lines. And then, fascinating enough, the gender divide is not a pure gender divide because we have this fascinating divide between younger women and older women. And I personally experience that because I tend to socialize and live with older women. And I get in a car and I drive to work and I see younger women. And so when I talk to the older women in my life, they say, this is our chance to finish the mission, to complete the revolution. It'll be the only opportunity in my life to vote for a woman. I doubt that there will be a one again as long in my lifetime. And so I'm going to grab this. And I simply do not understand these younger women and why they're not voting for Hillary Clinton. So I say, okay. And I drive into work. And if I see 3 or 4 women, younger women hanging around, I think, like any political scientist, I think focus group. Data points. One of the great advantages of being a political scientist over a physicist is that Bob can't talk to his data points. I can take a data point to lunch. And that's a big advantage. If he could talk to a quark, he would. Instead, he talks to a lot of quirks. But anyway. All right, I got carried away. Anyway, so I go to the younger women and I say, I repeat all the lines that I get from the older women. I say, you guys are traitors to your gender. Why aren't you supporting this woman? This is a historic opportunity. And they get all worked up and they say, what do you mean this is our only opportunity? We're going to live long enough to see women, and we don't regard this as the messenger that we want for the women's movement. So like any good older male, at that point I keep my head down and I've learned enough. Okay? I don't weigh in on that. But as a social scientist, I certainly find it fascinating. Secondly, the racial divide. And here what's interesting is if you go back to 1988, the racial divide was white and non-white, the Rainbow Coalition. But the racial divide this time isn't that simple because you have the Latinos voting in most states, not in all, but in Texas and in California most notably. The Latinos went overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. Now that wasn't true, interestingly enough, when the Latino vote is less than 10%, as it was in Maryland and Virginia, the Latinos voted the way the rest of the population did. So that gives you a clue that it has something to do with the structure of the political machine in Texas and in California and the degree to which the endorsements of key people like Villaraigosa and Nunez probably played a role. And A. Smith was the campaign manager in both. I could go down that route, but I won't. But the point is that the racial or ethnic divide is very interesting and not what we saw in 1988. Thirdly, there's the class divide. That is to say, huge differences between people who have college education, even more with people who have graduate degrees in terms of their support for Obama versus the people with lower levels of education supporting Hillary Clinton's campaign. I could also add by religion that in states, just as sort of markers, if you find a state with over 40% Catholics, then there's a good chance Hillary's going to win. That's the case in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island. If you see states where the college educated are greater than 50%, like Vermont, good chance that Obama's going to take it, and he did. If you look at the Latino vote, if the Latino vote's over 30%, which it was in Texas and in California, good chance that it's going to go for Hillary Clinton because they were going 2-1 for Hillary Clinton. And if the black vote's over 30%, then it's going to go overwhelmingly for Obama. And guess what? I mean, I don't know what people were smoking when they thought Mississippi was going to be close. I mean, nothing I would recommend anyway. So, most of these primaries have gone in predictable directions. They're compositionally based. It's not completely true. Wisconsin's an exception. Because if you look at the demographics of Wisconsin, it looks a lot like Ohio, a little less of all those parameters, but a little bit more highly educated and more liberals in it. So there are some differences to those rules of thumb. Now, of all of these, the one that I find most interesting is the age one, partly because of it dividing the gender vote, but also because we haven't really seen age as a critical issue in the Democratic Party since 1968, that magic number that I mentioned earlier. 1968 is going to be a theme of this talk, by the way, accidentally. And so what's in there? Why are the young people so enamored of Obama, or at least more so than the older people? And I think part of it is stylistic, that he does come across as more hip. And I get emails from my students with clips to YouTube, and they tell me to go look at the clips from YouTube, and I look at them, and they're hip-hop presentations of Yes We Can and that kind of stuff. And I go, doesn't do anything for me, but I get it, I think. And then I take it home and I show it to my 50-year-old friends, and they go, what's wrong with these kids? They think that's telling them something, So part of it is stylistic. Part of it, and I think a more important part of it, is a rejection of 90s politics, which they grew up with. These are the sons and daughters of boomers. They grew up with 90s politics. And what were the characteristics of 90s politics? Well, there was a polarization. And the polarization led to a politics of what I like to call diminished universe targeting, i.e., and the ultimate of that was 2004, where Karl Rove announced that what they would do is go for the base and forget about the middle, because the middle was only 7% of the voters. And diminished universe targeting is kind of a metaphor from the consulting world, which says, let's go for the people that we know are going to vote or we know are going to be our allies, and let's make sure we get the best turnout out of that we can. And let's forget about all the other voters, because they're uncertain and it's more expensive to go after them and it's not so efficient. And that, of course, has been challenged by Howard Dean. And Howard Dean has come in as the chair of the DNC, and based on his own campaign experiences, he had the 50-state strategy. And the 50-state strategy was go out and energize the Democratic Party in states that the Democratic Party has no real hope at this moment in time to win the Electoral College votes of, the Idahos, the Utahs, et cetera. And the notion was that there's a short-term investment that every campaign makes in order to win, but there's a long-term investment that the party should make to build the ideas and to build the infrastructure of future victories. So Howard Dean, I was in Washington, and Howard Dean was a source of enormous derision among the professional operatives. How could he waste this money when targeting was the way to go, and going after the traditional voters was the way to go, and the base was the way to go? Well, you know what? I think part of the Obama phenomenon, the fact that he's won almost all the caucuses minus one or two, is that there was a confluence. There was a confluence of the 50-state strategy, which energized a lot of activists, probably Dean-type activists in these states, and the Obama strategy, which said, well, I'm behind. She's sewing up, like in California, she sewed up 19 out of the 34 Democratic congressmen. She sewed up a lot of these states with these endorsements. I'm going to go out into the boonies. Well, the boonies were having a renaissance due to the 50-state strategy. So I personally think the two came together. Nobody's really talked about that. The other thing they rejected was that I think a lot of younger people are rejecting. In addition to sort of shrinking the electorate, they want to expand the electorate. They want to expand out. I think the other is the rejection of triangulation. Now, what was triangulation? Triangulation was the strategy that the Democrats adopted in the 90s to become more like the Republicans in order to get into power. And the way to think about it, as political scientists do, is that there are periods of realignment, ideological realignment. And those of us who were in school in the 60s, including the class of 1968, I told you I kept mentioning it, we grew up in the liberal paradigm. The liberal paradigm was the dominant paradigm. That changed in the late 70s, and the conservative paradigm continues to be the dominant paradigm. But the Republicans were able to win within the liberal paradigm, Nixon in 1968, there's that term again, and Clinton was able to win in 92. How were they able to do it? They were able to do it by adapting to the dominant paradigm. And that defensive kind of politics of adapting to the paradigm is, I think, what people are rejecting, particularly the young people, just as in 68 people rejected dominant paradigms. I think they see in the growth in the environmentalism and global warming, in the rebirth of multilateralism and the commitment to multilateralism, and in the perception that insecurity in American society, insecurity, more than inequality, insecurity, that people who think they have safe lives in the middle class no longer have them because their pension systems are no longer defined benefit systems, or their companies are closing, or because their health care may not be there if they lose their job, et cetera.
that perception of insecurity has created the beginnings of an understanding of what government can do, what positive function. So having lived through various realignments, it's possible that down the road there will be a realignment, but in the meantime, there are these cycles, and I think you're beginning to see in young people a search for a new paradigm about politics, and it's built around those issues. Okay, second point I want to make, and I'll do this quickly because I know I'm going a little bit long. The rules have shortened the Republican race and lengthened the Democratic race. And I want to start with a whine, and that is that I wrote, after the New Hampshire primary, I went back to the green papers and I studied all the rules. And I had done some work on this before, but when I read them really closely, it became apparent to me, especially after the New Hampshire primary, when you remember Barack Obama lost the primary in the popular vote, but tied in the number of delegates. And I couldn't understand why the press coverage didn't mention that, because I had read the rules and I knew the rules were all about the delegates and the pledged delegates, and I didn't understand what was going on. Why was it all about this momentum story? And so I wrote an op-ed piece that weekend, basically saying, look, press, you've got to pay attention to the rules. And I made this prediction, so I'm bragging. Theoretically, I said, this is back long before anybody else said it, I said if the Democratic primary voters remain divided, causing tight outcomes in many states, the delegate totals could remain very close. The eventual winner of the Democratic nomination could prevail without winning California. I said, if he or she managed to do well enough to garner a significant share of the state's delegates. On the Republican side, narrow victories by John McCain could translate into a decisive advantage in pledged delegates in the winner-take-all states and end the contest sooner than on the Democratic side. In short, even though the Republicans are by every measure more divided and conflicted about their choices, they could end up making their collective mind sooner, which is exactly what happened. Now, the one thing that I would amend is that as this has gone on, there's evidence today in the hotline that dissatisfaction in the Democratic ranks with the opposing candidate has doubled. So there is a cost to adopting fairness as the rules. Now, you might say, well, how did the Democratic Party get into this? Well, remember 1968, and in 1968, Hubert Humphrey ran in only the did not run in any of the 14 primaries that the Democratic Party had. In those days, we only had 14 primaries. Now we have a little bit, the Democratic Party has a little bit under 40. I think it's like 39 primaries. And so the question was, how can you have a democratic process if the convention is going to choose something, a candidate that didn't stand for in any of those races? And you remember 68 was extremely tumultuous, and the party divided, and Richard Nixon got elected. Well, in 1982, first of all, there was a whole set of reforms starting in 68. The Democrats were constantly changing the rules. What were they trying to do? They were trying to make the process more transparent. They introduced proportionality, and they introduced quotas that allowed the party to be more descriptively representative of its constituency. But what happened in the intervening years between that and 1982 was that the Democratic Party lost very badly in some races, and in 1976, even when Carter won, it was perceived that he was not a strong candidate. And so the idea was that the party regulars had been pushed aside, that we had gone from an extreme of professionals to an extreme of amateurs. And we needed to blend the paints and get a hue which is not quite so extreme. And so the idea was, with the Hunt Commission, to let the party regulars have this superdelegate role where they would get to choose based on the electability. So the Clintonites are exactly right. The superdelegates don't have any responsibility to follow the pledged delegates. On the other hand, in 1984, in the race between Walter Mondale and Gary Hart, Walter Mondale finished with more pledged delegates but did not have enough to win. And it was the superdelegates that affirmed Walter Mondale getting the nomination. So there is precedent in the Democratic Party that the winner in the pledged delegates ends up getting the nomination. There's precedent that if you do the other in 1968, you can cause a lot of problems. So my view about the superdelegates is that while they're formally completely free, they're sociologically not free. Now, they come in a lot of different varieties. Some of them are DNC members, some of them are governors with statewide constituencies, some of them are elected out of congressional districts. But a key fact is that over half of them are elected officials. And one thing Dan will tell you is elected officials like to pay attention to public opinion, okay? And they don't want to get in the middle of a fight between two heated factions of the Democratic Party. So they're looking for the easy way out. I mean, Nancy Pelosi said this many, many times. Option number one, follow the pledged delegates. Option number two, and I think that if the lead stays over 100, that's what's going to happen. If it drops under 50, then it could get very messy. Then what will the superdelegates do? They will head for the nearest ledge they can put their fingers on, which will be what their district did or what their state did or some other criteria. Now, obviously, some of them are already committed to candidates. They may change it, but they've got their reasons for doing that. But I think the rest of them have stayed uncommitted for a reason, which is they didn't really want this role, and now they got it. With respect to Florida and Michigan, that's a mess. Obviously, what the party should have done was what the Republicans did very sensibly, which was cut the delegates in half. What are they going to do now? Well, they're talking about a mail ballot. I won't go into it now, but if you've never run a mail ballot before, there's a lot of steps that you have to take to make sure that, that there isn't fraud, that people don't get disfranchised. And you're going to have a major objection from the minority community they believe that mail-in ballots are fundamentally discriminatory against them because people do not mail those ballots in. And we have a registrar here from Yolo County, and she will tell you that this is the reason we haven't had more all-mail ballots is that there are a lot of objections out there. I actually, parenthetically, put in for a grant with the Pew Foundation to actually study whether that's true and whether there's something we could do about it, and we were turned down. I think that's, but maybe after Florida, that grant will be there. Okay, so let me just finish with what's likely to happen. First of all, do conditions favor the Democratic Party? Yes. There's a whole bunch of econometric models that take economic conditions, unemployment, inflation, growth, and GDP. They plug them in, and while they're not point accurate, very accurate, on the ends, they're very accurate. That is, if you have extremely bad economic conditions, you don't want to be the incumbent party. So if conditions degenerate into the fall, then that creates a non-level playing field for the Republican Party. Not insurmountable, but a non-level playing field for them. Secondly, of course, the war. The success of the surge, so to speak, has definitely made a difference. And the reason is that for a lot of voters, they vote most on what they observe in their environment and the immediate effects. And this war, because it was fought on credit, basically, and because with a volunteer army, hasn't really affected lives as personally as the 1960s crowd, those of us that were facing draft. And obviously, had this war been fought not on a credit card, or if it had been fought with the draft, it would have been over a couple years ago. It probably never would have started. So I think what will happen is that the war will be increasingly an economic issue. And you already see that, that the $12 to $16 billion a month that we spend on Afghan and Iraq alone is contributing to a $3 trillion debt. And you now see some papers coming out with distinguished economists like Stiglitz pointing out that that doesn't even take into account the indirect costs of the war in terms of the deaths and injuries and foregone wages and various other things that families face. So you're talking about a huge debt, and even if people think the Iraq war is worth fighting, and many Americans do, the question is at what cost, and given that Afghanistan is now even more dire than it used to be, where do you put your resources? I think that will become the way the war is debated. I think there will be a confluence of these two issues. Can the Democrats lose? Yeah. Do I need to go through the ways? No. I think all of you out there know all the various ways, and we're seeing it already. The alienation of the base, potentially, the growing dissatisfaction. I mean, the cost of fairness is that people are going to get dug in and they're going to get their noses bent out of joint. And then the question is, when the whole election reorients itself and the discussion becomes Dems versus Reaps, will women, if they don't get their choice, will they look at the court and say, I can't let the court have more conservative appointments? Or if the African Americans lose, are they going to say, well, I'm going to sit out this one and I don't care what it does to policies for urban America? I don't think that's going to happen, but it's clearly changing conditions and alienation of the base are two of the many possibilities. Is it inevitable? Is it inevitable that the Democrats will lose? No. Because John McCain, as Dan well knows, is both a strong candidate and a candidate with some weaknesses. His age is a problem, for sure. It shows up in the polls. And the fact that he really has to make a very, very important strategic decision. And that strategic decision is, do you run as a conservative or do you run as a Schwarzenegger across party, post-partisan? That's not easy to do that balancing trick. And he's done it very effectively to date. He has a record of working with Democrats, but the Democrats will point out various ways that he has shifted back to the right on taxes and on border issues. So it's possible that he's going to have to define himself in ways that are potentially problematic. So we'll have to see, but it's not inevitable that the Republicans will win. I think with the uneven table, we're just going to have to wait and see whether the candidates match up equally or not. That's historically been the strength of the Republican Party, but we may get a different outcome this time. So again, I think that this election is something that nobody could have predicted, that we would go this long. Certainly lots of people thought the media momentum argument was the one that was going to hold the day. But I suspect that we'll be talking about who's going to be the nominee all the way up until June and maybe later.
Thank you, Professor Cain. Our next speaker is one of California's leading Republican political and media strategists. He has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, and in 2000, he served as the National Director of Communications for Senator John McCain's presidential campaign. He's a regular contributor for the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Sacramento Bee, and is a political commentator on radio and television. Please welcome lecturer of political science, Mr. Dan Schnur.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for having me here tonight. And first of all, I'd like to thank Sean for that very, very gracious introduction. It might not have sounded like all that much to many of you, but I'm a Republican who teaches at Berkeley. And that's the nicest thing anybody's said about me at a university event in quite some time, Sean, so I really appreciate it. I'm grateful to be here tonight, but I will admit to you I am also lucky to be here tonight. Last Saturday, I attended the Cal-UCLA basketball game down at Pauley Pavilion in Westwood, and will admit I was fortunate enough to get out with my life. For those of you who are watching on television, I was the one who was saying, "That's not allowed," at the very end of the game. But justice will prevail, and we'll get back to that a little bit later. I'm grateful for a few other reasons and to a few other people. One, I want to thank the Chancellor for allowing me to participate here with you tonight, but also for allowing me, he and those for whom I work at the Poli-Sci Department, to allow someone who took 7 years to get through 3 colleges to teach in an institution like this one. It's been a great honor and a great privilege, as Bruce has said, for 12 years, and it's something that I very much appreciate. So, Chancellor, thank you very much. I also, in the interest of this very, very rare mutual admiration society that Bruce Cain and I seem to have developed tonight, we're not usually this nice to each other, I do need to thank Bruce, because 13 years ago, I did come to him. I had burned out on politics. I wanted to try something different. And as he told you, he encouraged me to come to campus to help him teach a class. The part he left out was the following semester, he asked me to teach it on my own as a visiting instructor. And then the following semester, he asked me to teach it again and again. And after 7 years, he went to the political science department and explained to them that I was no longer technically visiting. anymore. And so without his help and his support and his example, I would not have had this opportunity also. And I also want to echo Bruce in thanking the Travers family for the extraordinary work they have done at the Institute of Government Studies, for the Department of Political Science, and for the undergraduates of the University of California, Berkeley. I have lost count. I don't have any good way of keeping track, but of those I can keep up with, I have between 60 and 70 former students working in politics or government or media in California and Washington, D.C. or elsewhere. Like Bruce said, at one point, 11 or 12 of them working for the Schwarzenegger administration, many more working for Democratic members of the state legislature and of Congress. At one point several months ago, I counted alumni, not of the department, but of my own classes, working for the McCain, Romney, Giuliani, Thompson, Huckabee, Obama, Clinton, Biden, Richardson, and Edwards presidential campaign. I've had students who've left Cal and have gone to work for the ACLU and for the Christian Coalition and basically in pretty much every organization in between. And the reason they're able to do that is because of the programs, because of the events, because of the resources that are made available to them at our campus and at our institute. And I thank the Travers in private, but I wanted to thank them in public also for giving the students the abilities and the resources and the support to make that kind of difference in their communities. Thank you very, very much. The course I teach, Political Communications and Strategy, or Political Strategy and Communications, I can never remember which. It's a class in how to run a campaign. I call it the only vocational ed class at the University of California, Berkeley. But I also try to teach the students of the importance of public service, and I try to teach them of the nobility of public service. One of the things that I learned when I first came to this campus 12, 13 years ago, one of these things that puzzled me is I had been told by friends of mine in politics, Democrat and Republican alike, that young people don't care about politics, they don't care about government. And by way of proof, they cited polls that I'm sure, they cited statistics that I'm sure you all have seen, showing that young voters turn out in smaller numbers than any other generation in America today or in recent American history. And what I realized when I got to campus, first anecdotally and then statistically, is that that only tells part of the story. That same generation that votes in smaller numbers than any other generation in America today or in recent American history, they volunteer their time back into their communities at greater levels than any other generation in America today or going well back into our past. And I asked myself, I said, why is it? Why is that? Why is that the case? Why is it that the same young person who will give hours and hours of themselves every week to a Meals on Wheels program, to reading to seniors, to teaching underprivileged youth how to do his math homework, to community cleanups and neighborhood watches, hours and hours and hours into these volunteer programs, they won't take 15 minutes every 2 years to vote. Why is that? And the answer, and Bruce touched on this just a little bit in terms of the appeal that Barack Obama has to the youngest voters in this country, and that I'll talk a little bit later when I talk about the impact of communications technology on the political process. The answer is that we have created a political process that intentionally shuts them out. And when I say we, Bruce, I don't mean we Republicans. I mean we, the people who run both parties at the state and national level. And we have told them through word, deed, and example that it doesn't matter how many doors you knock on, it doesn't matter how many phone calls you make, it doesn't matter how many envelopes you stuff, that someone's going to show up, a CEO, a union boss, somebody, with a check for $1,000, for $100,000, for $1 million. And they get 1 million votes when you only get one. So it's only natural that these young people would come to a very logical decision. They would decide, why should I bother when the elections are bought and paid for? I need to find another way to give back. And they do it through volunteering. And what I try to tell them is that's noble, that's wonderful. I have nothing but the greatest amount of respect for those who volunteer their time back to those who are less fortunate. But there's only so many parks you can clean up. There's only so many kids you can teach to read. There's only so many meals you can deliver to so many shut-ins. If you want to make real change, if you want to change not just your block, not just your neighborhood, not just your community, if you want to change your city, your state, your country, your world, you have to go inside the gates. And I try to encourage them with the resources that have been given to us by the generosity of the Travers and others. What I try to tell them is there's a way to do this in politics, in government, and other kinds of public service. And to me, that's the real untold story in this election, which is that these young people, these 18 to 25-year-olds, for the first time in my adult life, have decided that participating in traditional political politics is worth their time and effort. And to me, that is the most important, the most remarkable development of this election. Some of it is Senator Obama and his message. A lot more of it are the communications and technological tools that these young people have that us older people are still familiarizing ourselves with. But for whatever reason, long after the dust has settled and President McCain, President Obama, or President Clinton has been sworn into office, I suspect that people are going to look back at the 2008 campaign. And old fogies like me are going to talk about 2008 the way Cain talks about 1968. As the year that as the year that American politics changed. Now, I admit, and some of my former students I see out in the audience know this very well by now, I admit that I am probably at least slightly outnumbered in this room in terms of partisanship and ideology, and I want to reassure you that that's okay. Because I come from a family that is made up not just a majority of Democrats, not just predominantly Democrats, not just overwhelmingly Democrats, but when we gather for Thanksgiving or for Passover dinner, 60 or 70 or 80 Schnurs and Schnur derivatives all in one small house. Every single person attending, save me, is a Democrat. That wasn't supposed to be an applause line, ma'am. Thank you very much. It's also not entirely true. My cousin Hannah is a Green Party member, but I digress. So usually we get along pretty well. I love them, and they love me, at least in odd-numbered years. But this last year, you could tell that the election season was heating up. Because I got a phone call about a week before Thanksgiving from my cousin Ronnie. And the way it works in our family is the cousins take turns hosting Thanksgiving dinner, and it was Ronnie's turn. And Ronnie's a great guy, a little bit sensitive, but a really good person. And Ronnie says, "Hey, Dan, listen, I need to ask you a favor before Thanksgiving next week." And I said, "Sure, Ron, what is it?" And he says, "Well, I hope I don't offend you, but..." Now, I think most of you are smart enough and savvy enough and sufficiently experienced to know that when somebody starts a sentence with the phrase, "I hope I don't offend you," they're about to offend you. It's like whenever Bruce looks at me and says, "Dan, with all due respect," there is no respect to follow whatsoever, anytime in my immediate or forthcoming future. So Ron says, "Listen, Dan, we're hoping that this year, the rest of the cousins and I, we're hoping that you'd be willing to sit at the children's table for Thanksgiving dinner." He said, "Look, we won back Congress last year. The election looks really good for us next year. None of the adults want to sit with you, Dan." And I said, "You know what? That doesn't bother me at all, Ron, and I'll tell you why. Because I've been trying to talk sense into you adults, my family members, for years and years and years. I tried to talk to you about Reagan. I tried to talk to you about Bush. I tried to talk to you about Dole, about McCain, about another Bush, about Schwarzenegger, about Pataki, and you never listen. It's wasted time. It's wasted energy. It's wasted oxygen, you adults. But the children..." So I'm not allowed to play with my nieces and nephews anymore, unless there's a representative from Common Cause or League of Women Voters there to monitor us from the courts. But I bring this all up because this same search for undecided individuals is what drives this election. And I want to talk more briefly than you would think at this point. I want to talk about three things tonight. I want to talk briefly, of course, about the Republicans and how we ended up nominating Senator McCain. I want to talk about the Democrats and where that nomination process is headed. And finally, I want to talk at least briefly about something I mentioned a moment ago, the impact of the advances of communications technology on this campaign, because I think that is the real story that historians are going to look back at in terms of the first decade of the 21st century in the political process. So start with the Republicans. Republicans, I would suggest to you, is the completely unbiased former communications director for John McCain for president. And I should hasten to say I'm not involved in his campaign this year, but obviously greatly treasure the time I spent with him 8 and 9 years ago. But I would say this, and I say this not just as a former employee of the senator, but as a relatively dispassionate observer of the political process. My Republican Party stumbled and stumbled and stumbled and stumbled, and finally stumbled into nominating the best possible candidate they could for President of the United States. And when I say best, I am not making a moral judgment or a value judgment, I'm saying the most electable. Some of you may have heard the old joke. You've heard the old joke about the two guys who are on a camping trip, and a bear wanders into the campsite. I see a couple of you nodding. And both of the campers are understandably nervous. There's this bear here. And one of the two campers starts to lace on his running shoes. He starts to put on his sneakers. And his friend says to him, "What are you, crazy? You can't outrun that bear." And his friend looks at the other camper and he says, "Yeah, but I can outrun you." So at the outset of the Republican primary process, you had a situation, a three-legged conservative coalition of the type that my friend Bruce described a little while ago. You had a conservative base of the party, already restive because of all sorts of excesses and errors they saw committed by a Republican Congress over the previous many years. And they looked at a field of Republican candidates, none of whom were completely satisfactory to the conservative base of the party. Mike Huckabee was conservative on social issues, but not so much economically or on national security issues. Fred Thompson, once they woke him, appeared to be conservative on some issues, but not as committed on others. Romney, currently sufficiently conservative, but only recently. Giuliani, not so much. And then there was John McCain, whose apostasies on issues like immigration, on issues like global warming, on issues like the original Bush tax cuts, had left him persona non grata among the base of the party. So I'd suggest to you that the most important word uttered in the Republican Party, in the Republican primary, therefore, over the past couple of years, over this election cycle, was not the word taxes, was not the word terrorism, but rather was the word macaca. And for those of you with long memories, you may remember then Senator George Allen of Virginia, in an effort to insult a young volunteer from his opponent's campaign, used a phrase which, depending on your perspective, either was or was not an ethnic slur, but certainly was taken that way by the young man. And when George Allen uttered the word macaca, not only did he begin a downward spiral that cost him his reelection to the United States Senate, but at that point, headed toward what seemed to be a fairly easy reelection campaign, George Allen was then the presumptive frontrunner for the Republican nomination for president, the preferred candidate of the party establishment and the preferred candidate of social conservatives. And upon his political demise, each of the candidates, all of the candidates, rushed to fill that hole. John McCain tried to become an establishment conservative, and the result was a campaign that almost went bankrupt. Mitt Romney tried to become a social conservative, didn't work so well. Giuliani tried to become a social conservative, worked even less well. Every one of the Republican candidates tried to fill that gap, and every one of them failed, including John McCain. The only difference was that John McCain failed first. He failed fastest. And so in the summer of 2007, when his campaign almost went bankrupt, he realized it was awfully hard to run an establishment campaign without any money and without any staff, and went back to running as the insurgent and as the maverick that had characterized his previous campaigns for office. Is John McCain completely acceptable to the conservative wing of the party? Certainly not. Will he attempt to pacify them through the nomination or through the selection of a running mate who speaks to the conservatives' most important issues? Of course he will. Will he continue to talk about national security, about judicial nominations and other issues on which he and the base are in sync? Of course he will. But ultimately, I suspect, he will, to Bruce's earlier point, he will try to run the kind of campaigns that he has run in the past, rather than the kind of base motivation campaign that we saw from Bush in 2000 and 2004, and that we saw from the Gore and Kerry campaigns in the last two election cycles. More of a traditional persuasive model, the kind of campaign that you've seen from Schwarzenegger here in California. That said, John McCain has a hugely uphill fight. I think the odds are stacked tremendously against him. Although the surge, as Bruce noted, has started to balance out public opinion in terms of the war, that is much more of an obstacle than a benefit for him. Certainly an economy that is headed into what looks to be a fairly difficult recession is also something that's going to disproportionately harm the party that holds the White House. And most troubling, the biggest obstacle for Senator McCain is sort of an 8-year itch that the American voters tend to have when it comes to electing their president. If you look back through modern American history, with the single exception of George Bush Sr., or as we now call him, Bush Classic, who was elected in 1988 after Ronald Reagan won 2 consecutive elections. Save that one election, neither party has won 3 consecutive presidential elections since World War II. And so I think the historical trends, the economic trends, and the national security trends really do tend to work against Senator McCain. By reaching out to the middle of the political aisle, as he can do, on issues that hurt him with conservatives, issues like global warming, like immigration, he certainly has a better chance at this election than any of the other Republican candidates would have had. That said, it is a tremendously uphill fight for him. Let me talk very briefly about the Democrats, because I think Bruce did an excellent job of covering that primary. It is primarily a demographic split and primarily a thematic split with relatively little policy difference between the 2 candidates. So I'll just add a couple of quick observations. For almost 20 years now, there has been a cardinal rule of Republican politics, a primary rule that we never ever forget except at our peril. And that rule is, you never, ever, ever, ever underestimate anybody whose last name is Clinton. Not Bill, not Hillary, not Chelsea, not George, because they're really good at what they do. Now, what I will explain to a Cal audience here is that Republicans tend to look at the Clintons the same way that Cal grads and Cal students tend to look at Stanford. We don't like them. We root against them. We want them to lose, and yeah, we want bad things to happen to them from time to time. But in certain things, in certain ways, they are very, very good at what they do. And what we have learned in this primary cycle, after Iowa, after South Carolina, and now just a week or 2 ago, heading into the Ohio and Texas primaries, is that this is a very, very, very skilled candidate. And if there's time in the question and answer, I can give you examples of her talents. But while Senator Obama certainly maintains an advantage, I don't think you count that candidate out until she is standing at a podium, graciously conceding to her opponent, because she is a very skilled and very experienced candidate, as the Obama campaign is learning. One other quick point on the Democrats, and then I'll get to the technology. Bruce talked about the nature of this primary and the elongated nature of this primary process. And he's right, the 2 parties, we have all sorts of differences, but the best way to tell the difference between Democrats and Republicans is the way we nominate our presidential candidates. Republicans are winner take all. It's very cut and dried. You win, you lose, you go home, you keep going. And that's it. Very no nonsense. Democrats, if you pardon me for saying, a little bit more nurturing. You didn't lose, you finished second. So we're going to give you some delegates just to show how much we care that you play, how much we appreciate that you played. It's like a kid's soccer team where at the end of the season everybody gets their trophies. Everybody gets some delegates in the Democratic primary. And it makes sure that the unrepresented voices in the party do get heard, and that is to the party's credit. But it also elongates the process, and what we have seen from this process is it tends to not so much disunify the party, because the anger towards George Bush is enough to bring that party back together pretty quickly once there is a nominee. But rather, one of the things we've seen over the last few weeks in particular, and will continue to see, is the Democratic Party, the Democratic candidates being dragged slowly to the left. Because as they reach out to delegates, as they reach out to superdelegates, they tend to be talking about issues in different ways and talking about different issues than they talked about 6 or 9 months ago. The debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement that characterized the Ohio primary, to me, is a perfect example of 2 candidates, 2 very smart, 2 very intelligent candidates, basically playing, can you top this, to say which one can be more against free trade with Canada and Mexico. And as the campaign now heads to Pennsylvania for 6 weeks and probably back to Michigan after that, I suspect that is a trend that will only continue. So once again, I think the Democrats, as Bruce said, start with a tremendous advantage this year for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. That said, I would not end this election prematurely, because Republicans, in spite of ourselves, have nominated a relatively electable candidate. And again, the longer this Democratic process, this Democratic primary process goes on, I think the more it weakens a nominee for the fall. I know we have some time for questions and answer, and I really would like to talk to you a little bit about the impact of technology on this campaign. But between Bruce talking far longer than he was supposed to, and me having learned my lessons from my mentor, having talked far longer than I was supposed to, I will I will cede the stage reluctantly. And once again, thank you for your time and your patience, and hope you found something informative in what you heard.
Thank you again, Mr. Schnur. We will now be having a brief question and answer session. There are 2 people in the audience with microphones. If you guys could raise your hands real quick, you should have no problem picking them out.
I would like to, maybe Professor Cain would comment on why it seems the Northern California counties voted for Senator Obama and the Southern California counties went for Senator Clinton. And the other thought I'd like you to comment on, either both of you, is do you really think that in the general election, men who look like you two will vote for either one of the Democratic candidates?
Didn't know we looked alike. That's a new one. Well, first of all, on Northern and Southern California, it actually follows from the demographic statistics that I gave you. Northern California, the counties have a high level of education relative to other counties. They have highly educated whites. And by the way, not all of the congressional districts up here. There were 6 congressional districts, I think, in the end that went for Obama. And 2 of them were in areas with a large number of students in it. So there was Lois Capps' seat, which has Santa Barbara in it, and there was Doris Matsui's seat, which has Cal State Sacramento in it. And so they had a lot of students in it. And then, of course, you had 4 African-American seats that went for Obama. And so I think it's largely compositional more than anything else. But the gay community went overwhelmingly for Clinton, and so that held down the numbers. And in the way it worked, if Obama had done a lot better in some of these Northern California seats that had 6 delegates, he could have got a 4-2 split. But because women, educated women, and as I said, the gay community went for Clinton, the numbers were a little bit less impressive than Obama had hoped for. As for whether, I assume you mean by white, distinguished-looking males, and I would say, yes, of course, some of them will, but there's all this discussion about the Bradley effect, and I'm not going to go into I think that's a nonsense debate, but I think the phenomenon is a real debate, a real issue, and that is we know from public opinion studies that people are not completely honest in their surveys about sexism and racism, period. They're also not honest about whether they voted or not. So, there are certain things that people are going to systematically lie about. So there will be some people who will be unhappy, with whoever is chosen on the Democratic side. Now, if the Republicans go with Candee Rice, as some people are pushing, or if the Republicans go with Kay Bailey Hutchinson, then sexists may not have a choice. They may be trapped, right? So that's the way to look at it.
I'll defer to Bruce on the first question, but what we see observationally watching the early primaries is, to grotesquely oversimplify, wine drinkers vote for Obama, beer drinkers vote for Hillary. And there's a much more complicated socioeconomic pattern at work there, but for all sorts of reasons, I suspect that contributed to the northern-southern split that you saw. On the second question, which I feel a little bit more qualified to talk about, being an old, white, distinguished-looking male, I'd make you a couple points to you. First of all, I believe as strongly as I believe anything, that this country is prepared to elect a female president, and I believe just as strongly that this country is prepared to elect an African-American president. I would add to that I am not sure that a sufficient number of voters in this country are ready to do both simultaneously, which means an Obama-Clinton or a Clinton-Obama ticket might be a little bit more history than a lot of voters are willing to take all at once. But no question, the American public, I believe, is ready for either one of those two eventualities. That said, will white men vote predominantly for Republicans? Of course they will. That's the Republican Party demographic base. I'm sorry? No question. There will, just because the majority of white men of distinguished-looking white men will vote for Republican, there will certainly be a good number who vote for either Clinton or Obama. That said, I think the more interesting question is not how white men will vote, because we pretty much know. and not how the African American and Hispanic American community vote, because we pretty much know. But in particular, white female voters, and in particularly white female married voters. Because as Bruce talked earlier about the gender gap between the two parties, what's emerged to just as great or even greater degree in recent elections is a marriage gap. Females tend to vote Democrat, males tend to vote Republican. Single voters tend to lean Democrat, married voters tend to lean Republican. And so when married female voters vote for a Republican candidate, whether it's Schwarzenegger, whether it's Bush, that tends to elect that candidate. When those married white females skew Democratic, they elect Gray Davis, they elect Dianne Feinstein, they elect Bill Clinton. So far more important than how Bruce and I are going to vote is how people like you are going to, who look like you are going to vote.
Oh, there you go. I think the mic, I'm sorry. They gave the mic over here.
Excuse me. Thank you. Last summer, Mr. Schnur and then Professor Cain, when McCain's campaign was about to go bankrupt, he signed up for the public financing provisions, which theoretically, I believe, put him in some kind of a financial disadvantage come after the conventions. Do you think that he will be held to it, and how much of a disadvantage, and I hope it will be, will that be?
After you.
Well, I mean, this is a big mess because the facts are disputed and there's nobody to resolve it because the FEC can't get the appointments made, so the body that would have to make the determination isn't itself determined, so to speak. And then you add to that there are some facts that are muddled here. Did he take the loan from the Bethesda Bank with the promise that he was going to get this public money? He says no. Other people, are suspicious. As I see it, I think if the Democratic Party is going to put a lot on trying to, hold him to this, I think, first of all, it's not going to work because the way the new campaign finance world works, there's so much spending that could be done by the independent groups and by the parties, controlling the candidate's spending, particularly somebody who's so good at getting free media as John McCain, I just think is a futile strategy. And secondly, I just think that there's something a little bit mean-spirited about that. I mean, he has been a defender of public financing. I think that's one of the few reforms that's really valuable, not so much because it actually equalizes things, but because of what Dan was talking about. I look at my students who want to get into politics and they have to raise 50 or 100,000 and they don't have enough friends and family to do that. I think public financing is a way to help people get into politics. So I'd rather not give public financing a worse name than it already has. So I would say the Democrats shouldn't push that point. Beat them on the issues. Don't beat them on the technicalities.
Bruce and I are agreeing way too much. It's making me uncomfortable. A couple quick points. Number one is John McCain has certainly suffered more than his share of misfortune throughout his life. But I would argue to you that over the last 8 or 9 months, he has been the single luckiest man in America. If Mike Huckabee had not defeated Mitt Romney in Iowa, if Rudy Giuliani had not pulled out of New Hampshire, leaving his votes for McCain, if Fred Thompson had not pulled votes away from Huckabee in South Carolina, if Huckabee had not pulled votes away from Romney in Florida, if all these things had not happened, John McCain would not be the Republican nominee for president. And now he is in a fix. Because when he needed that money last summer when he was broke, he agreed to abide by the public spending limits. And now it's clear that it might not be such a good idea. Why is John McCain lucky? Because Barack Obama, back when he was 30 points behind Hillary Clinton, made exactly the same promise. And one of the things I learned with Senator McCain in 1999, long before we started to build public support, is it's really, really easy to be noble when you're at 3% in the polls. When the race gets tighter is when it gets trickier. So now all of a sudden McCain has the opportunity to say, I will abide by public financing as long as Senator Obama keeps his promise. And so if Obama decides not to, for whatever the reason, deciding that they should come to some sort of agreement about the George Soroses and the Swift boats of the world, whatever the reason, if Obama decides not to abide, then McCain gets out of it too. But he only gets half the mud that he would have because the other half goes on Obama. So either way, he ends up on a level playing field. Once again, an extraordinarily fortunate 9 months for my former boss.
Hello, for Dan Schnur. Two fairly specific questions, but maybe they illustrate the larger campaign. Ohio, with NAFTA. How does John McCain, given his statements on the night of the primary, win Ohio? How could he win Ohio? And given the very azure color of California, how could he possibly win California?
For those of you who didn't hear the question, first the gentleman congratulated me on the brilliance of my presentation earlier. Said he found it absolutely fascinating and absolutely persuasive. He's going to go out and change his party registration right now. But notice just two small flaws in my thinking. Ohio and California, two tiny flaws. First of all, I should hasten to point out that I said earlier, and I truly do believe that this is a tremendous uphill fight for McCain, for the reasons I mentioned. As far as Ohio, remember that what drove Clinton and Obama leftward on trade issues was a Democratic primary. And a Democratic primary, just like a Republican primary, has a fundamentally different makeup than a general election electorate. And so while Ohio will no doubt still be suffering the effects of a recession, while it will still be hemorrhaging jobs to sunnier climes either in this country or elsewhere, the fact that you're looking at a much broader electorate than a union-dominated Democratic primary, I don't think makes being for free trade necessarily a disqualifier for him in Ohio. That said, the overall state of the economy will make it much more of an uphill state for him than it was for Bush in 2000, 2004. California is uphill for John McCain, too. Republican has not carried California since my first campaign out of college, Bush Sr., in 1988. Do I think McCain will win here? Probably not. Do I think he has a better chance here than any other Republican? Yeah. Do I think it's worth him investing some time and money? I do. And I'll give you one single issue, an issue that makes many of us, myself, a little bit uncomfortable, to talk to you about why I think California could be in play for John McCain, and that is the issue of illegal immigration. John McCain's campaign almost destructed last summer because of conservative anger toward the naturalization plan that he was and still is supporting. The idea that you cannot hire enough buses to move 12 million people back across a southern border, and that if you impose a certain number of penalties and fines and waiting periods and so forth, that there should be a path toward citizenship. That almost killed him in a Republican primary. In a general election, that's a position that's much more likely to work to his benefit in a state like California, particularly, and I say this not as a partisan, but as an analyst, as an observer, particularly if he runs against Senator Obama, who during the primary took a position in favor of granting driver's licenses to those who come to this country illegally. For those of you who watched the 2003 or 2006 governor's campaign, you know that regardless of your own personal feelings about that issue, it's a very volatile issue in California, and it's an issue that worked to Governor Schwarzenegger's great benefit. So I think in a McCain-Obama campaign in California, McCain once again starts out with a disadvantage. But probably, if he's smart, decides to at least to invest some time and resources here, not only for reasons related to immigration, but global warming and other issues that have caused him such trouble with the party base. Bruce, do you want to rebut?
No, that's fine.
We have time for about one more question, so.
Professor Cain, since you've stated that the Democratic primary race is basically about demographics, I'm wondering to what extent can heavy use of the media, like television advertising, ever trump the demographics? In other words, Obama spent twice as much in Ohio as Clinton,
Right.
but lost.
Well, I'll repeat the question. The question is, if the Democratic race is about demographics, then what role does the television advertising play, if I understand? It does. I wouldn't say it trumps. I would say that if you look at going from New Hampshire to Ohio and Texas, in New Hampshire, 40% of the voters in the Democratic primary made up their mind in the last 3 days of the campaign. 40% of the voters. When you get down to Texas and Ohio, 20% of the voters were still making up their mind at the last minute. So about 80% of the voters had made up their mind before, and of that, some amount of that was by demographics. Now, you have to be careful when you make arguments about demographics. It's not an iron law. It's not that every woman over 50 is going to vote for Hillary. And these are statistical tendencies only. So in that mix of 20 that are making up their mind at the end, there are a lot of different types of people, but many of them are people that get most of their news from TV or from the electronic media. And so they tend to be very susceptible to the messages that come at the end because they don't read the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Post and all the various things that are on the web. They're more likely to get it out of the local news, or they're more likely to get it out of the TV ads that they see. And yes, if you run an effective ad that makes people fearful, and some of the most effective ads are play on fear, then you can move people at the end. This is the way California used to do politics in the 80s. People waited to the end of the campaign, and then you would hit the opponent with a mailer or ads that would move voters at the end before the other side had a chance to respond. You can only do that trick so many times, and I think Obama should pay attention to the fact that in recent elections he's been losing that last 20% because the Clinton campaign had done a much more effective job of going negative at the end, and he's got to have some responses for that. The problem, of course, is that Obama has pledged not to do negative campaigning, and the easiest response is to go negative on the other person and not get yourself into defending. So yes, it has played a role. It will play a role. I'm sure we'll see it in Pennsylvania as well, because I'm guessing that even after 6 weeks of campaigning in Pennsylvania, there will still be something like 15 or 20% of the voters that will be making up their mind in the last couple days.
If I can just add to that very, very quickly, just a quick couple points that are worth taking out of here about advertising. Number one, ads don't persuade. Ads motivate or ads discourage. What a good advertisement does is it motivates a candidate's supporters to turn out to the polls or discourages the opponent's supporters from turning out. Relatively few people get persuaded by advertising. Number two, ads are much less credible than information presented through the news media. How many of you have ever bought an automobile because of all the fun those people on the commercials seem to have driving it? Most voters are just as intuitively suspicious as you are of those ads. And third and finally, I think particularly in a news media saturated environment like Pennsylvania is going to be for 6 weeks, once again, this talks about the power of online communications. In a world of TiVo, in which everyone except for a candidate's most committed supporters are going to skip past political ads, the opportunity to be part of a political conversation rather than just being on the receiving end of a monologue is transforming politics. That's what's fueled Obama's support among young voters in particular. But over a 6-week period in which so much public and media attention is focused on one single state, the opportunity for Pennsylvania voters not just to be talked at, but to talk to each other, I think has a much greater impact than the amount of money that either campaign spends on advertising. The question is, who do voters trust? Do voters trust politicians? Usually not. Do voters trust the news media? Infrequently. Voters trust each other. They trust their friends, they trust their coworkers, they trust their neighbors, they trust their colleagues. And the communications technology now allows those voters to communicate directly with each other. I suspect that the amount of money spent on advertising in Pennsylvania is going to be much less important than the amount of money and the amount of time spent on grassroots organizing, which, if you don't mind me saying so, is a pretty good sign for American politics.
Before we move into the raffle, which I know you've all been eagerly waiting for, please join me in thanking our guest speakers again, Bruce Cain and Dan Schnur. And thank you, Chancellor Birgeneau. All right, very quickly, our raffle, our first item. All right, you get a whole bag worth of Cal goodies. The first bag is going to Bridget Brennan, Hellen Diller family. And the second bag goes to Chancellor Birgeneau. No, wait. Just joking. He gets his for free. The second bag goes to Claire Pezziri, School of Sacred Heart. Are you still here? There she is. Congratulations. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please have a safe drive home and go Bears.